Kia ora Aotearoa, good evening and welcome to the Union Report, where we review the news week through the lens of industrial disputes with union leaders, commentators and politicians. Joining me tonight to discuss events is President of the Corrections Associations of New Zealand, Bevan Hanlon, and Junior Vice President Angela Roberts from the PPTA. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, Issue 1. National promise not to cut back frontline services. How much more frontline are teachers? Are larger class sizes the answer? Issue 2. Who should have the power to incarcerate? The state or a private company? What is the real cost of prison privatisation? Issue 3. Are the new Labour law announcements a negative for workers and unions? Plus we'll wrap the show with a final thought, but let's start this show with Issue 1. When elected, the National Party were at pains to point out that they would not cut frontline staff. But with classroom sizes about to increase, how much more frontline are teachers? Angela, will New Zealand children get a better education from larger classroom sizes? Because most academic research is very clear on this. It says no. Is this counterproductive policy?
Absolutely. The Minister keeps talking about doing more for our most vulnerable students. And the problem with simply putting more students into a classroom is that, for example, in junior secondary school with larger classes, you have less opportunity to individually interact with students, and those are the years where they're most vulnerable for disengagement. In the senior secondary school, the poor principals, they're rearranging even less deck chairs on the Titanic, and they are in danger of having to cut courses. So where you've got the ability to provide a course that is meeting the needs of, say, our more vulnerable students, those sorts of cuts need to be made.
What the bloody hell's going on here? We have one of the best public service education systems in the world. Why are we trying to fix something that ain't broke?
Well, it ain't broke. But in saying that, there is always room for improvement. Absolutely. And we at PPTA, as professionals, are really happy to sit down and discuss ways of having thoughtful and coherent change that will improve education for all of our kids. Now, the problem is that this announcement from the Minister basically seems to be based on nothing more than ideology, because, as you say, the evidence is not there. She keeps talking about it's about teacher quality, which is true. Teacher quality is really important, which is why we need to make sure we have the best people coming into the profession, that it's very high status. But you can have all the PD in the world and be a fantastic teacher, but you're going to be less fantastic with more kids in the class. The important things in the classroom are your ability to provide really good feedback to students and to form really good relationships with students. And the other thing is that you need to have the time to collaborate with your colleagues, because actually that's the best way to get quality teaching improved for everybody. It's been borne out in New Zealand research, such projects such as Te Kotahitanga, where when there's a collaborative approach, things change for the better.
Bevan, the National Party's counter to these cutbacks are incentive payments for better outcomes. Does that type of resourcing work in the public sector? I mean, should CANS members, for example, be penalised or given bonuses for recidivism in prisoners?
Well, that's exactly the point, is that they've tried this in prisons before. They tried it with the previous private prison and it didn't work. In fact, that prison ended up costing New Zealand $9,000 per prisoner per year more. Right. That's why they got rid of them. None of this rubbish about ideology. It actually just didn't work. Right. What we found with those perverse incentives for bonuses is people cut corners. They hide the facts. And we've already found that with an OIA that's been put out through the media now, and the performance of Serco in just their first 6 months. One of the outstanding things that sort of came across to us is the fact that they've got 90% prisoners attending drug rehabilitation courses, yet they've only actually assessed 30% of their prisoners to do them.
Well, how does that work?
Well, that works because if they have them attending, they get a bonus.
Okay, so when you pull these types of incentives into the public service, it doesn't end up working. How should the public service be measured?
Well, the public service should be measured by the public. They should be the ones that say, yes, we're working well, or no, we're not. We should be obviously measuring ourselves with what happens around the world, but there's pretty much standard indicators around the place. Within prisons, we know that if you've got low suicide rates, you've got low incident rates, you're running a good prison service. To to knock it down to just recidivism rates, a little bit tough to put on prisons, because the reality is that prisons are the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. They're certainly not the place where you're going to get all your rehabilitation done. You're going to start the process, but that's after the process has been pretty well destroyed. You've got to actually look at the fact that this is a community issue that we need to sort out, our high incarceration rates. And that's really where the problem needs to be dealt with.
Angela, does education feel like it's under attack at the moment? Larger classroom sizes, charter schools and national standards are all deeply criticised by everyone with any expertise in education. Does National loathe public education?
Well, that's how we feel. I mean, we feel completely betrayed by this class size announcement. The Minister, in her speech to the business people, which is another challenge altogether. I mean, why didn't she announce it to us? She announced it to business, but anyway, she announced to them that she wanted to collaborate on the development of a good sound appraisal system and how performance pay would work. But saying that is one thing, but she certainly hasn't proven it. In the last more than 6 months, the PPTA and other interested parties in secondary education have been put in significant resources with the ministry to investigate if there is a class size issue in secondary schools. And the recommendations from her own ministry said to the Minister for Education that there is a problem, especially in large schools. They do not have the ability, they just don't have enough teachers to keep the class sizes to a reasonable level, to have the sort of engagement that is expected of our world-class curriculum. And so they're very hollow words when she says it's about collaboration, and then we find out through a press release that she's made this significant policy shift.
What do you feel more betrayed by? Charter schools or having John Banks as Associate Minister?
Ooh, that's
it's a tough one. It's a tough one.
Quite frankly, I don't think John Banks was the person who was the true advocate for charter schools, because when you have an opportunity to ask him about why he believes that charter schools...
He doesn't seem to know much about it, does he?
No. So, you know, it makes it very difficult to engage when they're not really sure what it's going to look like.
Well, that's wonderful for the sector. Bevan, in education, we're seeing the government constantly cutting public funds to public schools to give that money to private schools. In 2010, private education staggeringly had an increase of 22%, a correction seeing the same type of tactics in prisons.
Oh, we certainly are. 20% of the prison population is now in private hands, so that's Serco running Mount Eden Corrections Facility. That's all money that people seem to think the prison ferry pays. It's the taxpayer that pays Serco to run these prisons. We still pay them, they just claim to do it cheaper. So far they can't provide any evidence that they do that. So far all they can provide is evidence that they've had escapes, that they're not doing their job, they're not meeting their targets, and boo-hoo for them, they're not going to meet their bonus. But I can guarantee you that they don't budget their spend on getting a bonus.
Right. Do you think the public have any real sort of awareness of what's going on with prisons at the moment?
No, I think that's one of the cunning things that the national government have done with their step towards privatisation was they hit prisons, because the reality is that most people don't care.
Right.
People go to prison, they're not really cared what happened. And if you think about what they said leading into the privatisation of Mount Eden, they spoke about how private prisons will take stuff away, and they spoke up things like the Hilton at Milton. When the reality is that the prison in OCF is actually just flash because it's new. There's nothing special there. It's got underfloor heating because that's the most efficient way to heat a prison that freezes with permafrost over winter. It's just common sense. People can't pull the wires out of the wall and cause problems with it. If you look at what private prisons have done around the world, they've actually softened prisons around the world, because what they do is they run them with less staff, because that's where their savings are made. And the way they do that is by appeasing the prisoners. So they give them more and more things. In the UK, where they're right into this, they've had prisoners breaking into their private prisons because they get better TV in their prisons than they do in their council lots.
That's wonderful. Question to both of you. We have one of the best education systems in the world, and it's held up by other countries as a great example. Will these changes make public education better or worse? Worse. You clear on that?
Absolutely, because it isn't just about the very narrow focus on, for example, class size. I mean, as you say, if the minister wanted to find money for professional development, which that's fantastic, we welcome the opportunity to improve professional development for teachers, but to find it from teacher salaries rather than from the money that goes off to the private sector,
Yes.
who, funnily enough, run small classes.
Yes.
I mean, if
And they don't have to do national standards either, these charter schools, do they?
Oh no, that would be a great way of making sure you didn't have to worry about national standards.
Yeah, they
to
get
opt out.
increased money.
Yeah, well, we're not sure what it's all going to look like, but it's the sort of the trifecta of appraisal, which appraisal, performance pay, and class size. That trifecta is pretty impressive. Now, when you start having performance pay, which inevitably is contestable rewards, that is completely counter to a collaborative approach, which is proven in all of the jurisdictions that are doing better than us, that is the right way to have systemic change. So, yeah, the performance pay in combination is not good.
Change is better or worse for public education?
I think they're certainly going to be worse. Not knowing a lot about education myself, even though my wife's a teacher.
Yes.
I do have 2 kids at school, and for years the argument has been, let's get the class sizes down, let's get the class sizes down, and now election's been and it's turn it around, let's get class sizes up. It just doesn't make sense.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2. Education isn't the only public sector facing privatisation. Corrections are now firmly in the spotlight, with private prisons moving into New Zealand and gaining more and more influence. By 2014, with the current lineup of public prison closures alongside the new private prison at Wiri, New Zealand will have 20% of our prison population under private prisons. That will be the highest level in the world. What are the ramifications, Bevan? Serco has won the New Zealand contract. They have an appalling record of prisoner abuse overseas, run the worst prisons in Britain, and are responsible for the detention camps in Australia. What does their entry into New Zealand mean?
Well, their entry into New Zealand means we're going to have a lot more people in incarceration.
Yep.
Because that's the reality of private prisons. You look at the fact that we're now saying we should be putting these boat people and such forth into detention centres.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually what Serco run in Australia.
Exactly what Serco runs in Australia.
Surprise, surprise. Who would have guessed they'd come up with ideas of putting more people in prisons? Call them detention centres, call them prisons, it doesn't matter, they're the same thing. I think one of the best studies that's available is one that was done last year in Florida. They're big on privatisation. They've privatised their prisons. By law, their private prisons must deliver a 7% saving.
Yep.
They haven't managed to achieve that. This study actually shows that for the 20 years that they've been operating private prisons in Florida, the crime rates have dropped.
Yep.
The incarceration rates are up. We're tougher on sentencing. In fact, I think there's an example on the weekend where a lady just got 20 years for firing a warning shot into the air whilst committing a crime. Her first ever offence, but it's mandatory sentencing, and she's doing 20 years. Now, the reason the private prisons are behind this is they lobby, and it's really clear in the States because they've got an open system.
Yes.
If you're going to lobby politicians, you've got to say what you're doing, and they put millions of dollars a year into lobbying these politicians and into these groups for tougher sentences and all of these things, because if the crime rate's dropping and you run a prison, you've got to keep it full.
Of course, of
so
course.
Let's get longer, tougher sentencing, even when they don't need them.
Angela, private companies will argue they can incarcerate more cost effectively using market forces, whereas critics will counter that the state must be directly responsible for anyone held against their will. From a philosophical point of view, who should be responsible for incarceration, the state or private companies?
Well, when you're talking about the justice system, that is obviously a responsibility of the state. Supply, your basic economics, supply and demand models, you talk about the best way for a business to make money is to sell more. So effectively, the more prisons you have, the more profitable you're going to be. And you can see the difficulties with that when actually the incentive is, to have a bigger prison system. I think, there's some basic problems. You don't have, like in a basic market model where if people aren't happy with your product, they can go elsewhere. You're going to have a prison say, I don't like being in this prison, I'll leave. I mean, you cannot use the market model in this. And if you were in a level 2 economics class that was small enough, you'd probably get the opportunity to learn that.
Bevan, the government's line that Serco will be fined for reducing recidivism is a productivity red herring, isn't it? Because all these fines come out of Serco's bonuses, not the bottom lines. The only real gains will come from cutting your member prisoner to guard ratios, won't it?
Oh, it certainly will. They have already got a substantial saving in there. When Mount Eden and ACRP were publicly run and they were at full muster, they had 980 prisoners.
Okay. And
granted, Mount Eden's an old prison, so it has a few extra staff, but there were 427 staff there.
Okay.
Serco have a brand new building and a $20 million upgrade of the almost new building. and they have 200 staff working.
So they've cut it by 200, over 200 staff members.
Yeah.
So the ratio for guard per staff member has dropped.
Is in the 50s.
Right. So it's increased incredibly, has it?
Yeah, so 50 as
Is that
opposed to
safe?
15. Oh, certainly not.
Right.
And that's why you've got escapes happening, because
Right.
there's just not the people around to make sure this stuff
Sure.
isn't happening.
Sure. Angela, in 2009, the Geo Group Australia managing director told the Select Committee into Private Prisons that, now this is the direct quote, "Privatisation is not about cost savings. If that's all you want to achieve, I am saying that you are knocking at the wrong door." I'd put to you that these cost savings don't actually exist. Is this another example of ideology trumping facts?
Absolutely. I mean, because the problem is you've got externalities with those cost savings. It isn't just that small amount of, well, not significant amount of money, but that finite piece of money that's put into the prison or the school. It's all the other outcomes that you can't cost into it. And so, yeah, it isn't just about the cost. The cost-benefit analysis is much wider than that. And those private companies, whether it be a school or a prison, I can see a bit of a connection here.
Yes. They can move them straight through. Perhaps they can open them all with one.
The less effective I am, the more jobs that
Yeah,
I
that's
will.
right.
You're a real cynic.
Question to both of you then. Is the real issue here that corrections has been taken over in the public debate by the lynch mob? That you've got politicians, you've got media that whip up crime, they whip up the anger that you get from seeing that crime. You get politicians who are calling for harder, longer sentences. The problem here is that the public just don't care, do they, about prisoners or prison systems?
That's the reality, and they don't understand the flow-on costs of what we're claiming. We hear about all the murders and the increased crime rates and things, but the reality is we've actually got decreasing crime rates.
That's right.
All these things are actually turning, and one thing that's really surprising, it's because the national government have gone soft on crime. And it's not soft on crime, they're actually just doing the right thing.
Right.
But they're not making a big song and dance of it, because they also know that if they do, that bandwagon gets on their back.
Yes.
And all of a sudden their costs go up as well.
Yes.
So they've changed the way they're policing. It's a softer way of policing, but it's an effective way of policing, and it's dropping the crime rates. And the flow-on effect of that is we're dropping the prison rates.
So how do we have and engage with the public to try and create a different dialogue?
Well, that's the tough thing, getting the public to realise. And I think this upcoming budget's got to be something that's getting people talking, because we're talking about a $900 million prison to be built shortly when we simply don't need it built. There's 3,000 spare beds sitting idle in the country now. Why would we build another 1,000 beds at a cost of $900 million over a deal that's going to be locked in for 25 years, and we've got no way of getting out? We don't need the beds. What it means is we will fill that prison. Just to make it work.
Bevan's up against it. I mean, everyone loves teachers. Everyone wants to help teachers along. No one cares about prisons. How do you enter a dialogue with the public that gets beyond that lynch mob stuff?
I think you always fall, and I think you guys do this, you fall back on evidence. You look at the jurisdictions that are around the world that are succeeding in reaching the goals that you want to reach, and you look at it evidence-based, you drop the ideology. Something we're trying to work towards is being able to sit down and have systemic conversations that are non-partisan, and we say, right, where's the evidence, where do we want to be in 20 years' time, and how are we going to get there, and remove the politics and the ideology from it. And I think that would work in the justice system as well.
Do you think we're seeing too much polarisation, that people are getting into one side of the argument and refuse to see it from the other side? Because that's the danger in America. Are we going down that path?
It is difficult not to when you only get a 3-second soundbite, and you can mislead the argument. So, for example, when our Minister for Education talks about performance pay and appraisal, and says, and then sort of dismisses the unions as, well, they just want to protect their own, and that's their job, and good on them. But actually, we welcome that conversation. But, you know, it's like there's a smokescreen. She's talked about performance pay and appraisal, and actually it's not about that right now. It's about cutting frontline teachers. And when we keep coming back to that, and we're trying to unpack the numbers, and they're not as benign as she's talking about either when you actually work out how it's going to happen. And that's the difficulty. She puts up a little smokescreen that makes us react, and we say, typical reaction from a teacher. And it completely distracts from the reality.
Very, very quickly, final question on corrections. Is it true that the assessors who have recently decided to close down the prisons in the provinces didn't even go to the prisons?
Yeah, well, Corrections asked for a report to be written a couple of years ago. Basically, they wanted the consultancy firm to come up with a way of closing prisons, I don't know, market test or whatever they wanted to call it. And so they engaged a firm, told them exactly what they wanted to do. The firm even said it would be nice if we went to the prisons.
They didn't even go to the prisons.
Wasn't required, not for that particular report.
Unbelievable. Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3. Last week, the government was caught out planning new labour laws aimed against unions. How does allowing the employer to do as they please protect workers? Angela, under these new powers, employers will be able to walk away from wage bargaining if unions reject unreasonable demands. Isn't that counterintuitive? Shouldn't unions be empowered to walk away from unreasonable demands?
I think the idea that you have good faith bargaining is completely gone when you know that effectively
it's just
either party can walk away.
Right.
I think that the power of negotiations being robust and being able to be productive and being able to have those really hard conversations is absolutely underpinned by a requirement that you have to stay at the table. Sure. The opportunity to walk away would be, well, it's just really scary to consider, and I think it would be far too tempting when things are going to get tougher and tougher and tougher.
Bevan, how are you supposed to serve your members if the government can pass legislation that allows them to walk away from wage bargaining if they propose something unreasonable to you?
Well, what's unreasonable?
Exactly.
I would say offering less than a cost of living increase is unreasonable because that's cutting your wages. But we've got employers right now, today, trying to cut people's wages, not for any other reason but to increase profit. They're making a profit and they just want to make more of a profit. And instead of actually doing their job as managers and trying to work out how to do that properly, they're just going to take a whip to the old worker and give them a couple of lashings and cut their wages and say, look, you're on more than bread and water, you don't need butter with that, you'll be fine.
And in this recession, there has become the mentality, hasn't there? You're lucky to have a job. You've got a job, you're lucky.
And that's what they're relying on. It's disgraceful, when really, if you want to get out of a recession, you've got to get that little economy of New Zealanders paying for New Zealand jobs and New Zealand workers doing the New Zealand thing and keeping that money in the community, because that's where we make our money.
Question to both of you. The AFCO and Ports of Auckland disputes are two recent examples where employers were making unreasonable demands. Under these powers, good faith just goes out the window, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And it just, the thought of unions not being able to be involved in the conditions for workers is horrifying. The thing is that if you look at, I know that in education, and I'm quite sure that in really complex systems like justice, the best gains are made when you have the unions involved, not just in conditions, but in all sorts of other systemic decision making. And when you don't have the ability to engage effectively with your workers, then your workplace suffers, and so does your bottom line will in the long term suffer.
Good faith just isn't here if you have a boss who can make some crazy claim to you and then walk away from the table.
Well, it's just not good faith at all. It's just weighing the whole thing towards the employer. They get to put the demands, and you've got to bow to them, or they just lock you out.
Is this just second term head flush from a government of hey, we're in, let's just pass, see how far we can go, or do you think this is that they look to this as a legitimate way that labour relations should be from here on in?
Well, I think the scary thing for us is this is what the national government think is the way of the future.
Right.
It's taking us back to the 1900s, but they think this is the way forward. The rest of the world's progressing away from this, but again, we're regressing, and that seems to be a common theme with this national government.
Final question to both of you. 50,000 New Zealanders are leaving New Zealand every single year, some of them to chase the GC dream. In fact, you could argue that the GC is the most cunning immigration tactic ever invented. In the wake of this latest round of union attacks, is the message for workers with skills to just leave and go to Australia? Is that the message?
I think that the message is absolutely, this is not a place where we want workers to have productive lives, good working conditions, enjoy their jobs, are motivated to be innovative and successful and productive and effective. All of that stuff is gone when it just comes down to to how you carve up your profit for your shareholders. And so any thinking worker is going to be gone, because it is about money, but it's also about conditions and about relationships with your employers. And the best, most productive businesses actually have good relationships with their workers. And this is a very clear message from the national government that the most valuable resource in this country, its people, are not an important part of what is going to make this country grow.
Your members could be making a lot more in Australia, couldn't they? Your counterparts in Australia certainly have looked after, aren't they?
Oh, they certainly are. They're on 20 to 30% more than us.
Wow.
And we've just ratified an agreement for less than cost of living, but it means that we get through another collective agreement, whereas the Australians are signing up for 4, 4.5 and 5. So that gap's just getting bigger and bigger. The national government claimed that they're going to close that gap. Well, there's no indications that they're doing anything except making it easier to get across. Now, the Western Australians are recruiting right now in New Zealand. They need 280 staff. They know that we're closing prisons. They offer 30% more than we do. They offer safer prisons. They offer outstandingly safe prisons compared to what we operate in. Even their private prisons pay more than our public prisons here. And so you've got a company like Serco who operate 2 prisons in Australia, and if we were true to the, if the government was true to their word and they wanted to bring people across for true competition, surely Serco would be bringing the same conditions and rates of pay. But they're not. They're actually now managing to be the highest paying private prison company in Australasia by paying people in WA. And they're now also the lowest paying private prison operator by paying people in New Zealand.
Unbelievable. So there really is no reason for your members to stay in New Zealand, is it, when you've got opportunities and wage increases like that in Australia? Oh,
most definitely. We've got people sending us emails daily asking for contacts in Australia to find out what they've got to do to get across there.
Disgusting. That's just crazy. Thank you, Ben. Let's wrap the show with a final word. Angela, your final word this week is?
I guess my final word is to a challenge to our Minister for Education. She told, like I said earlier, she told business people this week that she wants to collaborate and make ours an even better performing education system. And the challenge to her is to come and sit down and talk with the professionals and have a conversation about the evidence that will help us to move forward, rather than sitting down with Treasury.
Yes.
Because they don't seem to be looking at the evidence of the best performing education systems. In fact, they're looking at the education systems that are looking to us, ironically. So my challenge is to the Minister is to put her money where her mouth is and show us that she really does mean to support our most vulnerable children.
Bevan, your final word this week is?
Well, our final word is tell us why. Why are you building Wiri? The reality is it's a $900 million prison. We don't need it. We've got 3,000 spare beds now. That's after we close the ones they're proposing to close. There's $1 billion deficit, so that would be a big hole in that deficit, $900 million. You could build 4 conference venues in Auckland for that. You wouldn't have to get into bed with Sky City. There's numerous things we could be spending $900 million on. We certainly don't need to be getting into a 25-year mortgage with some private operator.
Thank you, Bevan. Thank you, Angela. That's it for the show. Check out our Facebook site for ongoing union campaigns and actions, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter account for all the latest show updates. Thank you for watching Aotearoa. Join us again 8 PM next Monday for the Union Report here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Good night, New Zealand.